Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the 9 studio albums by experimental alt-rock gods Radiohead. Radiohead formed in Abingdon in Oxford, not far outside of London, where the 5 members were all going to school in the mid-80s. Singer Tom York, drummer Phil Selway, bassist Colin Greenwood, and guitarists Ed O'Brien and Johnny Greenwood, Colin's brother. They all formed a band called On a Friday because that was the day of the week that they rehearsed, and they played the Oxfordshire shoegazing scene alongside bands like Ride and Slowdive. They made a demo, and on the strength of that demo they were offered a deal by Island Records, but remarkably they turned it down because they all wanted still to go off to university. While all at university, different universities, they carried on playing together in the Oxford scene, and they were eventually spotted by EMI, who offered them a 6-album deal. A 6-album deal, you don't get those anymore, and eventually signed them to their Parlophone subsidiary. The record company asked them to change their name before they released anything, and so they took the name Radiohead from a Talking Heads song. And they made the Drill EP in 1992 and eventually released their debut album Pablo Honey a year later. They went on to make 9 studio albums, selling millions of records to often fanatical fan and critical acclaim, whilst overnight changing the industry model for artists, something we'll talk about as we go along. It's no exaggeration to say that in many ways Radiohead may be the single most influential rock band of the last 30 years. I mean, through their early albums, they flirted with international superstardom before taking the road less travelled and very deliberately steering the band towards more sort of esoteric and avant-garde music, which won them as much critical kudos as it did sort of lose them perhaps some mainstream fans. Admirably, the lineup has remained the same all these years, and by all accounts they are a very good bunch of blokes and absolutely committed to their music, as well as a number of altruistic and charitable causes. But let's begin. So we start at number 9 with their 5th album from 2001, Amnesiac. The band had so much material for the album that preceded this, Kid A, that at one point that was going to be a double album, but instead they released this one 8 months later. This time they preceded it with a single, Pyramid Song, and this album's very much Kid A's sort of less polite, perhaps slightly uglier kid brother. It's less cohesive, and in parts it sounds like a bunch of Kid A outtakes. It's just as experimental as that album, and it still has some wonderful moments, like on the single Knives Out. But I confess, I think by this point I'd sort of had enough of the Radiohead experimental side of things. And by the end of Kid A, I kind of wanted my old band back. But, little did I know they were gone for good. And I'd have to sort of change my expectations. The album, of course, still got to number 1 in the UK, got to 2 in the USA and went platinum. And by now it seemed that Radiohead were at that point, where that enviable point and position where they could pretty much make any record they wanted. And the public were on board with it. At number 8, I'm going to put their 8th album from 2011, The King of Limbs. I think this is a tough record to love. Following the sort of slightly more traditional format of In Rainbows, which had come out 4 years before, the band had taken a bit of a break. They wanted to distance themselves again from guitars and songs, and much of this album was written on loops and computers, and some of it was actually recorded at the home of Drew Barrymore, the actress, of all people. And the album just falls short for me on interest, really. I mean, Lotus Flower is a good song, but I find much of the rest a bit tedious and repetitive. They released it on their own XL label, and it was their shortest album they'd made at 37 minutes. But funny enough, it was their most lucrative album they'd made to date, because it sold 300 copies direct from the website, because they were doing everything in-house now on their own XL label. All proceeds going to the band. When finally released in physical format, it went to number 7 in the UK and 6 in the USA, and it has its fans, this album, undoubtedly, but it also definitely has its detractors too. At number 7, I'm going to put from 1993 their debut album, Pablo Honey. This album came out right in the peak of grunge, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and all those kind of bands, and undoubtedly this album owes a huge debt to grunge music. It's a big influence here, but now that we know what was to come, I think this was clearly a band who'd yet to develop the confidence and the technical studio knowledge to properly express themselves. Having said that, it does contain the band's biggest ever hit, Creep, which is that self-loathing grunge anthem classic that, to this day is something of an albatross around the band's collective neck. This is a good album, though, don't get me wrong. It's got some other great songs on here, like Anyone Can Play Guitar. But it just lives in the enormous shadow of the two albums that followed it, and and also just the band's general legacy. I think reception when it came out, it was fairly muted, but as time has passed, it has picked up a lot more fans, and dare I say it, particularly those who didn't favour the more experimental direction that the band was to take a few years later. Number 6 from 2003, I'm going to put their 6th album, Hail to the Thief. This was the band's first really explicitly political album, and it's there's 14 songs on here, clocking in at an hour long. So they're clearly angry at this point, and they had a lot to say, and it's packed with intent. Opens with the haunting 2 + 2 = 5, and after 2 electronic albums, this is. The guitar sounds are back on this record, but the melodies are even darker than before, I think, and the echo of their electronic influences really do linger on here quite heavily, but this time sort of aligned with the guitars. There's some good stuff in here. There's There and Go to Sleep and Sail to the Moon, but it's a lot to take in, and it doesn't always feel that coherent to me. The band themselves have said that they wanted to make this album quite quickly, and they expressed some regrets with the track listing and the album's length, and I can understand that, but it still sold 1 million copies in the USA and went platinum in the UK. So at number 5, and now I think we're really getting into the really great Radiohead albums. They've never made a bad album, but these next 5 albums to me I think are real greats. And at number 5, I'm going to put their 9th album and most recent album from 2016, A Moon-Shaped Pool. This is the total opposite to Hail to the Thief, the album we've just been talking about. It really has a coherent sound, and it has a flow to it that makes it one of the band's most rewarding listens. It's orchestral and it's lush, but it still has the band's idiosyncratic way with the melody and lyrics. It opens with the fabulous Burn the Witch, and then moves into the equally great Daydreaming. And it's an album you can get lost in because it has an atmosphere that just pulls you in and absorbs you. And it's very much seen as Johnny Greenwood's album because he did most of the orchestration. And the band wanted to get away from computers and too many loops, and they wanted to work in the moment, recording as they were writing. They rather than save stuff on hard drive and sort of go back and fiddle with it later. Famously, the recording was halted when they worked on the soundtrack to the theme song to the James Bond film Spectre. But the song they presented, the Broccolis, was far too dark and rejected, never got used. And there's a little bit of a bitter niggle, I think, there, that they wasted time out from recording this album to go and record a theme that was never used. But the song itself, Spectre, you can find it on YouTube. It's very, very good, well worth checking out, and would have added a much darker hue to the film itself. Thematically, on this album, there's love, there's heartbreak, there's regret. The album closes with True Love Ways, which is a lovely song that the band had written and never properly recorded many, many years before. It was the 6th number 1 album the band had in the UK. It got to number 3 in the USA and just garnered a host of award nominations, and even won some of them. Too many to even go into here. At number 4, I'm going to put from 2007 their 7th album, In Rainbows. This is the first album they made after their deal with EMI Parlophone expired, and undoubtedly at this point they were by far and away the world's biggest unsigned band. And this album came out, and it's actually a landmark album, not just for Radiohead, but for the music world in general. They by going onto XL, their own label, and releasing everything direct to the fans, you are bypassing all the bricks and mortar and all the print costs and all of that stuff. So your costs are infinitely less, and of course you're not paying a record company slice either. So you're taking 100% of the profits. And what Radiohead actually did is, on this record, they said people could pay what they wanted for this album. So you could literally go online onto the Radiohead XL website and pay $1 for it, or £1 for it, even less if you wanted, I think. This was an extraordinary move. I think it not only sort of consolidated their relationship with their fans, but it really did herald in a new era in record label-less artists and DIY releases that exists to this day and is only becoming more and more prevalent. Going back to the music, I think perhaps it's an album where the band's electronica and more traditional songwriting sensibility work together best. You still have the agitated rhythms and loops, but they're married to a more sort of human lyrical bent, and still there's beguiling, beautiful melodies. Just listen to a song like Weird Fishes Arpeggi, and you can feel yourself sort of being pulled into this sort of deft, harmonic, mesmerizing musical whirlpool of melody and tune. I mean, it's just so beautiful, and it's so unique, and it's so Radiohead at their best. I think the album has a momentum to it. It grows really, really nicely. It feels very natural and unforced. It's 45 minutes long, only 10 songs, and that was a very deliberate reaction to the overblownness of Hail to the Thief. As a record, it had a huge impact on the industry, and when it finally did come out as a physical entity, it sold over 3 million copies, so quids in for Radiohead, ka-ching. And number 3, I'm going to put from 2000, their fourth album, Kid A. Radiohead were just enormous at this point, but they were uncomfortable with the critical and commercial success, and also they were just so musically restless that their answer to all of that was to abandon rock songs, traditional rock songs, and move into a sort of deeply experimental phase that encompassed ambient music and electronic music and utilized samplers and loops, synthesizers, and a sort of fragmented cut and paste writing technique that was facilitated by sequences like Logic and Cubase. Despite huge anticipation, Kid A was released with no singles or great fanfare. Again, another big reaction to just sort of the huge commercialism that had been sort of weighing them down after the last two albums. There were no videos released, and instead the whole album was released on the back of kind of one of the first proper internet viral sort of campaigns. But is it any good? Well, of course it is. It's superb. It's from the first notes of everything in its right place, which I think is a sort of slightly ironic title, as the whole album has a sort of unsettling, restless, sometimes uncomfortable vibe to it. But there's still that beauty in what Radiohead does. And it's sometimes hard to pin down how or why. I think it's just part of their enigmatic appeal. National Anthem, Idiotech, we're a world away from the rock epics of the first three albums here. And it seems the majority of their fans were on board for this ride and this crazy U-turn, which I find sort of very reassuring. Perhaps the most traditional song here is Morning Bell, which is a Radiohead song I absolutely love. The album went straight into the UK number one, of course, and became their first number one album in the USA as well. Also picking up Grammy Awards and nominations aplenty, and it got to number 20 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time. Number 20, possibly a little bit high. At number 2, I'm going to put... Well, hang on. Before we talk about these top two albums, these next two albums are the two albums that, really just thrust Radiohead right into the stratosphere of rock bands. So at number 2, I'm going to put their second album from 1995, The Benz. And this is where the Radiohead phenomena really took off. 6 extraordinary singles from this album: Street Spirit, My Iron Lung, Just, High and Dry, Fake Plastic Trees. It's without a doubt their most commercial album, if you could ever use such a word with Radiohead. But it's still dark and it's still dense. But the ambition in the music here is so impressive. It's unlike anything we'd heard before. The guitar playing was fresh and exciting, and it's a huge leap from just the album preceded it, a couple of years before, Pablo Honey. It's like the 5 members had sort of finally been let off the leash to make the record that they'd had simmering inside them for some years. Co-produced with John Leckie, who had worked with the Smiths, and the band really do credit Leckie for simplifying things in the studio. Keeping them technically simple, which meant that Tom York could just go on a roll with his songwriting, and apparently they were just pouring out of him on a daily basis. And these songs, they're powerful and emotional, and they're complex musically and lyrically in a way Britpop hadn't been. And, I think word of its quality soon spread. There was a big word of mouth about this band. And although it's the band's lowest charting US album, it eventually went platinum in the US. And that's testament to that word of mouth, I think. It went 4 in the UK and went triple platinum. And I think, by the end, by the time the embers were finally kind of stopped glowing on this album, you really did have to put a new place at the very, very top table of A-list rock bands for Radiohead. And that does bring us on to my top Radiohead album, which is the album that followed the Benz and part of this fantastic 1-2 knockout punch. It's their 1997's OK Computer, their third album. I remember vividly when this album came out. Britpop was in its death throes. Tony Blair had been elected Prime Minister with his whole sort of New Labour campaign, and of course 1997 was the year that Princess Diana was tragically killed. And this album was the soundtrack to all of that. It really felt like the whole world was waiting to hear it on the back of the success of the Benz. There was such an excitement for it. And rather wonderfully, Radiohead delivered. It's a quite stunning, beautiful album. And although it's a rock album, it has again that intangible Radiohead beauty in the arrangements and the sounds and the melodies that make it really sort of quite timeless and hard to pin down and pigeonhole. It's produced by Nigel Godrich, which they made a lot of their previous records with. Opens with the extraordinary Airbag and Paranoid Android, which I think is about as prog as a mainstream band ever got. And it lays down the album's, lyrical themes, about advancing technology and consumerism and how these things lead to a sort of social isolation and anxiety. But the supporting cast of songs here is just fabulous. Your Exit Music, Karma Police, No Surprises, Lucky. They're all sort of sweeping, stunning songs that took on even more gravitas live. And to this day, the band's appearance at Glastonbury after this album was released is regarded as one of the festival's greatest ever shows. You can find it online and it's fabulous. Do look out for it. The album went to number 1 in the UK, got to 21 in the USA, which was the highest to date, but went 5 times platinum and garnered a sort of dizzying array of awards and accolades. 42 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time, but it's topped many greatest albums of all time polls, especially greatest albums of the 90s. And it's yet another of those records which is in the American Library of Congress for its cultural significance. There is a kind of modern take on this album that it's slightly overrated and whingy. I'm not sure I agree with that at all, but what do you think? Anyway, look, that's my rundown of Radiohead albums. Away from the studio albums, there's Best of Radiohead compilation. There's I Might Be Wrong, which is a pretty good live album they've made, and all the members have dabbled in solo stuff and even film soundtracks. Radiohead fans are a real passionate, opinionated bunch, so I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that many of you are not going to agree with me here. But please, send us your lists, and let's all have a look and discuss it. I think, like I've said, the top 5 here are the great Radiohead albums, but undoubtedly it's the top 2 here that created the sort of Radiohead monster that the band itself spent the next 25 years trying so hard to kill off. Anyway, that's Radiohead done, and I'll be back again very soon for another Rock Records review. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye bye.